Hello, Carlos. How are you?
Hello, how are you doing? Thank you for having me on.
How are you doing? So thank you for joining us on Venezuela Decides. And we wanted to ask you to begin this analysis. What is your read on the relevance of the election process that is going on in Venezuela right now?
Well, it's extremely important. As I'm sure the audience knows, Venezuela is set to join BRICS fairly recently, which means having Venezuela be incorporated into this new emerging multipolar world led by Russia, China, Iran, and other key players saying no to American imperialist unipolarity. And with that joining of BRICS, what will come about in Venezuela is common prosperity, economic growth, and the general improvement of the Venezuelan population. What that is going to produce, of course, is a full solidification of the Socialist Party of Maduro within the Venezuelan society. So the opposition understands very well that this is their last opportunity to regain power, their last opportunity to sell out their country, their homeland, their people, their resources to America and the American imperialist powers who the opposition actually represents. So this is why they are so dangerous. This is why we have seen the calls for violence and terror. They hope to breed fear into the Venezuelan people, but as someone who has been able to see about a dozen or so voting booths today, the Chavistas have been out all day, as compañero Jorge Rodriguez was able to say not too long ago. It's a victory for Maduro as expected. And I think what was on the line today was Venezuelan sovereignty. Is Venezuela going to be able to forge its own path, its own future autonomously, or is it going to sell out its interests, its land to the U.S. and become once again a neo-colony?
Carlos, as we continue analyzing in part what you were saying about the relevance of this election process, of course, all of this process coming up to today, the election day, has been marked by an immense amount of media interference, what some have called a propaganda bombardment, and of course it comes to call once again the interference of major powers in Venezuelan internal affairs for what Venezuela represents in many aspects, and particularly U.S. interference in what is happening today in Venezuela. We were analyzing earlier today a tweet posted by Kamala Harris, Vice President of the U.S. What is your take on the position that the United States continues to carry towards Venezuela in this moment in time?
Well, it's important to understand that Venezuela is a very rich country, a country that's rich in people and that is rich in resources. It's got the second largest oil reserves in the world. And those are oil reserves that American imperial interests, private big monopoly entities, want to regain control of. And because they understand that there is full popularity of the Bolivarian revolution within the Venezuelan people, all they can do is go around and say fraud, electoral fraud. Well, the reality is that, as American president himself, Jimmy Carter, said, Venezuela has the most democratic system in the world. It's a system that I have been able to see here in my time in Caracas as an American, and I can confirm that what Jimmy Carter said is absolutely true. It is preposterous that the U.S., where only 19% of the American people think that their representatives represent them, has the audacity to sit here and talk about the absence of democracy in Venezuela, to sit here and describe Venezuela as an authoritarian hellhole led by a dictator named Maduro. It turns the world upside down, and that's all that they have. It is important to understand that the opposition is not even acting out of its own volition. They are not representing the Venezuelan people, and they never had. The opposition in Venezuela is essentially puppets of the American empire who want to go back to a condition where Venezuelan oil belonged to a small clique of Western multinational corporations that got rich off of stealing the resources of the Venezuelan people.
And now, moving forward, we were talking about the interference and the reasons behind this interference. And of course, one of the things has to do with the wealth that has Venezuela as a country that has, for example, of course, the oil and oil production, and that has been the key element behind a lot of the so-called sanctions or unilateral coercive measures targeting the country. Now, what can we think about what is going to happen from tomorrow onwards in the climate of international interference that is going on? How do you read that movement, that political moment right now?
Well, as you mentioned, Kamala Harris made a very ambiguous statement. She said that the U.S. is going to respect whatever the Venezuelan people democratically will. The problem with that, of course, is that the Venezuelan people have consistently, election after election, willed to continue the Bolivarian revolution, and the results are just completely tossed out, first by the opposition candidates within Venezuela, who have been also proclaiming that their treacherous traitor candidate was the one that actually won, and then, of course, by the U.S. itself, that rejects unfoundedly, with absolutely no evidence, the results of Venezuelan election. There's absolutely no evidence to any of the claims that the U.S. has previously made. So I think that there's little weight and way too much ambiguity in Kamala Harris' statement, and it opens the door so that as people are celebrating this great Chavista win, the far-right fascistic forces of the opposition come out and do what they've been promising for weeks, which is a bloodbath. They have been promising to terrorize the Venezuelan people, their own brothers and sisters. They have come out and sacrificed roosters, which are, of course, the symbol of the Venezuelan revolution. And the symbology, the imagery couldn't be any more clear. They're seeking blood. They're seeking to dispose of President Maduro and top leadership. There's comments going around semi-viral in the far-right Venezuelan medias and social medias about attacking not just Chavistas, but anyone who has ever aligned themselves with Chavismo. So these are literal forces of terror that are backed up by the U.S., and if the U.S. finds it worthy to intervene, that ambiguous statement from Kamala Harris could be such that if the opposition says they want, Kamala Harris can affirm that's what the will of the Venezuelan people is, and perfectly possibly send in forces to back up the opposition.
Carlos, I also wanted to ask you about the importance of activism and also how the comrades in the U.S., for example, can take a stance in this context. We're talking about the country's interference, we're talking about state interest, but we know that activism in the U.S. has also been very important to also point out the hypocrisy, point out and demand from their government a different stance on different international issues. Just this year, for example, all the mobilizations to stop the genocide in Gaza have been very important and very significant worldwide to at least turn the value on what is happening there. Do you see something like that being able to happen in regards to interference in Latin America and different countries, and specifically in Venezuela at this moment? What are the different things that could be done from there to support the struggle here?
The most important thing to remember is whether we are talking about the genocide in Palestine, the new Cold War against China, the proxy war against Russia, or the general wars that the U.S. wages against the axis of resistance, Iran, and other countries, or the current discourse and attacks on Venezuela, which of course include 930 criminal sanctions, also known as unilateral coercive measures. What is important for Americans to understand is that we should support these struggles against American imperialism, not simply out of some middle-class moralism and empathy. We have to support these struggles primarily because they are not two separate interests. The interest of the American people is the interest of Venezuelan sovereignty. It is the interest of Russian sovereignty, of Cuban sovereignty, of Chinese sovereignty. The enemy of the American people, the enemy that keeps us poor, that keeps us indebted, that keeps us desperate, is the same enemy that sends hundreds of billions of our tax dollars to Russia. it's the same enemy that questions unfounded elections in Venezuela, that it insinuates violence in Venezuela. So we have to understand, what my people in America have to understand, is that we have to support the Chavista government and the Bolivarian revolution, not out of some lofty ideals or morality or empathy, but out of a concrete realization that the interest that we have, the people who we're fighting against, is the same as the Chavistas. If the Chavistas win, if the Venezuelan people can affirm their sovereignty and continue their Bolivarian revolution, we win. It's interconnected. The people who we're fighting against are a part of the same class. Same people that put the 930 sanctions on Venezuela are the same ones that lead individuals like myself to be in $100,000 of debt for doing something as crazy as wanting to get an education, and that do the same thing to millions, tens of millions of Americans for daring to get an education, for daring to have a home to live in, or for getting sick and not having medical insurance. So the interest of the Venezuelan revolution and the interest of the American working class is one, and that's the most important thing I think we have to affirm and let the American people know.
Now, of course, despite of what mainstream media and also propaganda have been trying to impose a narrative on what is happening now in Venezuela, today democratic elections took place. There was a democratic day. People were out in the street celebrating. All the reports from both inside and also international collaborators say that the day was lived with a lot of tranquility. And this is a very important day in Venezuela. And sometimes it seems that the discussion regarding what the propaganda tried to install on Venezuela has not allowed us to understand this as an electoral dispute and to really understand what is this opposition that is running against the Chavez project, against the ruling party. What do they represent? What do they want? What type of country are they proposing as a model? How could you describe this opposition in Venezuela?
Well, I would have to go to the apostle of my motherland, Jose Marti, who described these people in a very telling phrase. He called them gusanos de corbata. He called them worms with bow ties. They're the sort of individuals that sell out their people, that sell out their homeland in order to have their pockets lined up and fattened by the American imperialists. So that's the essential character of the opposition. And this is why what we have to affirm is that what's at stake is not just the continuation of the Bolivarian process, but it's Venezuela itself. Because Venezuela's existence as an autonomous sovereign entity is intimately tied to the Bolivarian process. If the Bolivarian process falls, which I can assure you it will not, I've been seeing thousands of Venezuelans in the streets, and the vast majority of them are not only with the revolution, but willing to sacrifice everything to protect it. But God forbid, if the Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution fell, it would mean the end of Venezuela as a free, autonomous, sovereign entity, and the return to a Venezuela that is a neo-colony of the U.S. and Western multinationals who only seek to loot the very rich resources of Venezuela to accumulate as much capital as possible in the hands of a very few, while the vast majority of Venezuelans struggle.
So we were talking about different issues, and one of them, the most important, perhaps to think about the last years impacting the Bolivarian revolution has had to do with international interference, particularly the U.S., but also the UN, different sanctions imposed on the country. And I wanted to ask to you, what kind of strategies do you understand from a geopolitical stance that Venezuela has been taken and could continue to take to go over the sanctions and start in the path of overcoming these hardships that the last years appear to show that it has already been set on that track? So in terms of cooperation in the region, you were mentioning the Caribbean region, but also alliances all over the world. How do you see Venezuela from a standpoint in its relations, geopolitical relations around the world?
Well, the continual process of Venezuelan sovereignty and revolution, I think it's tied, as it is with Cuba, as it is with Nicaragua, as it is with Iran, to BRICS, because what BRICS represents is the skeleton, the basis, the foundation for a new world, a world where international relations have been revolutionized in terms of the logic that animates them, from unilateral imposition of America's will on other countries to what the Chinese like to call win-win relations. So I think it is evident, and this is why the opposition is so particularly dangerous this time around, that with Venezuela's inclusion into BRICS, we're only going to see an intensified version of what we've seen with its very close relationships with Iran, which is what has allowed Venezuela since 2019 to weather the storm, a storm where 99% of the earnings they were making were virtually removed because of the hardships of U.S. sanctions and hybrid warfare. Because it's not just sanctions. There's ships filled with oil that were coming from Iran that the U.S., like literal pirates, would kidnap and then give it to American oil companies. So it's a hybrid warfare that's been waged against not just Venezuela, but anyone who dares to exist outside of the sphere of influence of U.S. empire. And just like the relations with Iran have been the basis of Venezuela's economic improvement over the last 5 years, its inclusion within BRICS, its ability to engage with the Shanghai Cooperation Corporation, the Eurasian Economic Union, and all these other international institutions founded on a belief in multipolarity, a belief in bilateral relations that are mutually beneficial. Venezuela's incorporation into this new world that is developing is going to be the basis of its ability to defend itself from the attacks coming from the U.S. empire.
What do you think is the relevance of today for the region?
Well, it's a general victory, not just for those forces in the region which are actually sovereign, so the forces that are not controlled by puppets of the American government, but it's also a win for the up-and-coming, embryonic, but still very much developing multipolar world itself. It's a win that I'm sure will be celebrated in Iran. It's a win that I'm sure will be celebrated in Russia, in China. I got to speak with delegates from Russia and from China, and they are very much conscious of the importance of Venezuela in this up-and-coming multipolar world. So the victory of the Bolivarian Revolution today is something that has impacts well beyond just Venezuela, well beyond the Patria Grande, this region that Venezuela is incorporated in the Western Hemisphere. It has influences for the whole world. It's a monumental victory for the forces of multipolarity and against the forces of imperialism, which are showing more and more their decrepit character.
So you were talking about the reactions that are coming from other parts of the world. Of course, you were mentioning, for example, comrades in Russia following this election. How do you think that activism from all around the world are looking at what is happening in Venezuela, also looking at how different main international powers such as the US and the European Union, for example, are reacting to the democratic process in Venezuela, and what that can mean for other countries in the global south, for example? Whatever happens to Venezuela, is that a call of attention for the rest of the world?
It absolutely is. This victory in Venezuela is something that, as I mentioned, will be celebrated by all free people around the world. And look, we have to be honest with ourselves. The situation in Venezuela provides a lot of hope for a lot of people, and even I would so dare say that if we do our job correctly in the U.S., it will come a time where this is a victory that could be celebrated by the vast majority of the American people, because fundamentally, the interests that Venezuela is fighting against are the same interests that keep us miserable at home. And I would venture as far as to say, given the fact that recent polls show that only 11% of the American people trust what the legacy media, what the mainstream media says, I would say that a whole lot of them are probably skeptical about how the U.S. media is describing this election, which of course is the same narrative that it always uses. Because the opposition that they fund can't win, because they can't win the people on a platform of returning to being a neo-colony, they're forced to cry fraud months ahead of time on an electoral process that a president from the U.S. itself called the most democratic in the world. So the American people recognize that the media is there to lie to us. It's the media that lied to us about Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, that has lied to us about Russia and virtually everything. And that does it for a very specific reason. It doesn't do it just because the media are compulsive liars and somehow they always end up hiring really bad compulsive liar character types. They do it for a specific reason. They represent the interests that benefit from the overthrowing of these popular sovereign projects that are quite literally constructing a new world as it unfolds right before us.
And now, in the face of what you were saying regarding a lot of disbelief of the media, for example, and also that would be a sign that, well, many people are more and more aware that these are actually like confronting narratives, and there is a struggle going on there on how we tell our world and our struggles. What do you think is the role that alternative media, global south media, left media needs to play in this role, in this struggle? What does that media need to do to overcome that mainstream narrative?
Well, it's essential. In order for the system of those who put the accumulation of capital as supreme, in order for that system to survive, it needs to reproduce itself at the level of ideas. It needs these ideological institutions like the media, education, etc., that can convince people who have a fundamentally adverse and antagonistic interest to the ruling order that they should accept the ruling order. The only way to challenge the lies that are systematically pumped out by these institutions is to create alternative people's institutions. Institutions like teleSUR, institutions like Midwestern Marks, which I work as a director for. And I think, to get to something quite concrete, if we look at American Twitter, what's been trending in American Twitter, Venezuela has been at the top, the Venezuelan elections. And it's quite literally mixed in terms of opinion. You have people like Elon Musk, of course, who applauded the coup in 2019 in Bolivia and said, we'll coup who we want. I wonder if the lithium that is in Bolivia's ground had anything to do with it. But you had people like Elon Musk promoting a candidate like Machado that literally asked for the Zionist entity, the entity carrying out a horrendous genocide against the Palestinian people, to invade Venezuela. Musk endorses her and says that the future of Venezuela is with her. A few other far-right forces are promoted, a lot of them through bot farms. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. There's literal bot farms that are essential in getting things trending. And when they begin to trend, what you have is a changing of how things are seen. And the era that we live in, people come to pass judgments on the basis of how things are seen as being seen. If they go see a video and all the comments are negative, that's going to affect their perception of that video. It's a form of second-order observation. So you have on one side all of these people supporting the opposition, probably boosted quite a bit by bots. And then on the other side, you have my colleague who's here with me in Caracas, Venezuela, Jackson Hinkle, who's a communist, anti-imperialist media personality and journalist, a member of our party, and who's been the most viral person on Twitter, getting the message out. Our party, Twitter, the American Communist Party, has been able to also get messages out. And right now, it seems like there's really 2 or 3 creators that are getting the pro-Maduro narrative, which is the true narrative, out. And then the vast majority of the other people like Musk and far right-wingers who are spreading lies. And so that battle is essential.
Excellent, Carlos. So before we finish, I wanted to ask, in the face of everything that you were saying, in the face of the media bombardment or the propaganda bombardment, as one of the analysts called it hours ago, in the face of all of this context, what would you tell anyone from the audience hearing, not from Venezuela, not from the Latin American region maybe, but from outside in other parts of the world, what would you tell them about Venezuela? What do we need to keep in mind to understand what is really happening today in the South American nation and what is at stake there?
Two things. First, I've seen the voting process. I have participated in the end of campaign rally and was able to see millions of Venezuelans out in the streets of Caracas in tune with the words that Maduro was saying, singing Chavista songs. And, there's this great clip that went viral of a young kid, an 11, 12-year-old kid on the shoulders of his father in the rally that I attended, singing the national anthem of Venezuela. So what's clear to me, as someone who has been here for around a week now, is that the Venezuelan people are with the Bolivarian revolution. There should be no surprise that this has been an electoral victory for Maduro. The second thing I would say to our international viewers, to those outside of Venezuela, is to not think for 1 second that this is just a Venezuela issue. As we've been trying to hammer out throughout this discussion, this affects everyone. If imperialism is able to win, if the U.S. is able to return Venezuela to a neo-colony, having the little comprador elements of the opposition at the helm, but really being guided from the U.S., that's a big loss for the whole multipolar world. It's a big loss for La Patria Grande, for our America, for the whole hemisphere. It's a big loss for American working people who, of course, face the same enemy. So do not think for 1 second that Venezuela's election is just an issue of Venezuela. It affects all of us, and Maduro's victory is something that we should all celebrate because it's our victory too. And had there been a defeat, we should have also been saddened by that defeat because it would have been our defeat as well. But thankfully, as anyone who has been able to experience the pulse of the Venezuelan people would have known, what we have seen is a staggering victory of more than 20 points over the treacherous and traitorous opposition.
Excellent. Thank you, Carlos, for joining us in Venezuela The Sides tonight.
Thank you for having me.
That was Carlos Garrido, director of the Midwestern Mark Institute, philosophy professor, and also educational secretary of the U.S. Communist Party. We'll go for a short break now. Don't go away.